What if the bands that screamed about unity, brotherhood, and fighting the world together were secretly tearing each other apart behind the scenes? Heavy metal has always sold the image of loyalty. Brothers on stage, brothers in the music, brothers for life. But the real story of what happened inside some of the genre's most celebrated bands reads nothing like the mythology. Lawsuits. Fistfights on stage. Members recording in separate studios without speaking. Singers hiding terminal illness from their own bandmates. The worst divorces in heavy metal history were not just professional breakups. They were the kind of personal collapses that left people changed forever and sometimes left them unable to speak to each other again. These are 20 of the most painful and destructive band breakups the genre has ever produced. 20. Saint Vitus. Saint Vitus never had it easy from the beginning. They carved out a space in the doom metal world through years of low sales, grueling tours, and a scene that did not always welcome what they were doing. The punk community gave them more love than fellow metal fans, which tells you something about where they stood in the commercial landscape of the genre. They kept going anyway, driven by a commitment to their sound that most commercially minded bands never sustained past the first lean year. They broke up in 1996 after the accumulated weight of internal struggles and financial difficulty finally overtook whatever was holding the lineup together. Fans assumed it was finished. Then the 2000s brought a reunion that generated genuine excitement, and their 2012 album Lily F65 delivered the raw and heavy sound their most loyal listeners had been waiting years to hear. The comeback looked like it might stick. It did not stick. Members changed. Arguments resurfaced. Personal battles among individual members created instability that no amount of goodwill between the band and its fan base could compensate for. Among the 20 worst divorces in heavy metal history, their story sits at the entry point as the most recurring version of the phenomenon. A band that broke up, came back, and broke apart again across a cycle that their own talent was never quite enough to permanently interrupt. 19. Diamond Head. Diamond Head should have been huge. Metallica said so repeatedly in interviews and by covering their songs on a tribute album that introduced their catalog to an audience many times larger than anything Diamond Head had reached on their own. The talent was real. The songs were strong enough to earn the endorsement of one of the most important bands in the history of the genre. The internal dynamics were not strong enough to survive the creative disagreements that kept pulling the band apart from the inside. They broke up in 1985 after years of everyone wanting to lead and nobody being willing to follow. Creative fights over the band's direction accumulated until the accumulated weight of those arguments simply became too heavy to carry forward. The reunion in the 90s ran into the same walls the original lineup had built, and by 2003, they had broken apart again in a way that made the pattern impossible to ignore. The same problems that ended them the first time had never actually been addressed in the years between. Their story among the 20 worst divorces in heavy metal history is the most instructive about the specific limitation of talent as a stabilizing force inside a band. The songs were good enough to influence Metallica. The relationships inside the band were never good enough to sustain the collaboration that the songs required. Those two facts about the same group of people sitting side by side across decades is one of the genre's clearest illustrations of how a band can be more than the sum of its parts musically and still not be enough when the parts cannot tolerate each other personally. 18. Badlands. Badlands arrived with credibility built on the name recognition of guitarist Jake E. Lee, who had already performed with Ozzy Osbourne, and the vocal talent of Ray Gillen, whose voice and stage presence generated immediate respect from the hard rock community. The combination looked like it had every ingredient for a sustained commercial career. Fans had high expectations and the debut material justified them. What nobody outside the band's innermost circle knew was that the most devastating factor in the band's collapse was already operating silently before the first tour had finished. Ray Gillen was dying of AIDS and had chosen not to tell his bandmates. He attempted to push through touring while his health declined in ways his colleagues attributed to other causes. Confusion that turned into frustration, that turned into a kind of anger that had no accurate target because the real explanation was being carefully concealed. When he departed from a UK tour in 1992 without explanation, the band searched for a replacement without understanding what they were actually dealing with. He died in December of 1993. The last Badlands album, Dusk, was released in 1998, 5 years after his death, a posthumous document from a band that had already dissolved before it was recorded. Among the 20 worst divorces in heavy metal history, their ending is the most quietly devastating. A breakup whose central cause was hidden from everyone involved and whose full truth only arrived after the damage was already permanent and the voice at the center of it was already gone. 17. Godflesh. Godflesh built some of the most distinctively heavy and genuinely industrial music the genre produced across the 1990s, and the combination of Justin Broadrick's creative vision and the specific sonic identity the band had developed gave them a reputation that extended well beyond their commercial reach. Their 6 albums between 1989 and 2001 documented an artistic evolution that the heavy music world was following with genuine attention by the time the collapse arrived. Bassist Ben Green's departure immediately before a major tour in 2001 was sudden enough to qualify as a shock to the remaining members and to the fans who had been anticipating the shows. He felt the music had lost its essential character through the sonic changes on their final album, Hymns, and his departure removed a foundational element of the band's creative infrastructure at the worst possible moment. Then, Justin Broadrick suffered a nervous breakdown that removed any possibility of continuing regardless of whether a replacement bassist could have been found. The tour was canceled. The band dissolved in 2002 without a farewell show, without a public statement that adequately explained what had happened, and without any of the closure that a band of their significance deserved to offer its audience. Among the 20 worst divorces in heavy metal history, their breakup is the most completely silent, a band that produced a genuinely significant body of work and disappeared from it without a word in a way that left the people who valued what they had made with nothing to hold on to except the records themselves. 16. Mercyful Fate. Mercyful Fate helped shape the entire aesthetic and sonic identity of black metal, and their records from the early 1980s remain foundational documents in the genre's history. King Diamond's theatrical satanic persona and the band's musical sophistication set them apart from everything else operating in that space during the period of their greatest creative output. The talent assembled inside the band was genuine, and the music they made together was significant enough to influence an entire generation of extreme metal musicians who came after them. The split in 1985 came down to a fundamental disagreement about what the music was for. Guitarist Hank Sherman wanted to move towards something more commercially accessible, believing the band's existing approach was limiting their potential audience in ways that better production and more radio-friendly arrangements could address. King Diamond refused to compromise what he believed the music was supposed to be, and the philosophical gap between those two positions was too wide to bridge through any amount of negotiation. King Diamond departed and took 3 members with him to launch his solo career. Sherman attempted to rebuild with what remained and did not find comparable success. Among the 20 worst divorces in heavy metal history, this one is the most ideologically driven. A split that had nothing to do with drugs or money or egos in the conventional sense, but everything to do with 2 irreconcilable visions of what the music should be willing to sacrifice in order to reach a larger audience. Nobody bent. The band was the price. 15. Overkill. Overkill built a genuinely loyal fan base through the thrash metal scene of the 1980s, and guitarist Bobby Gustafson was central to the sound that created that loyalty across the band's most celebrated early recordings. His playing defined the aggressive and technically precise approach that separated Overkill from the more commercial end of the thrash spectrum. And the fans who followed the band understood that his contribution was foundational rather than interchangeable. What the fans did not see was how completely the internal dynamics had deteriorated by the time the public rupture finally arrived. The fight was about money and creative control and the specific question of how much input Gustafson was entitled to in decisions about the band's direction. The other members believed he was demanding more than his role warranted. He believed the band was systematically diminishing his contribution while benefiting from it commercially. Neither side was fully willing to examine whether the other's position had any validity, and the escalation that followed produced a departure that generated anger on both sides, lasting well beyond any reasonable professional dispute. Both parties said damaging things in interviews for years after the split. sustaining a public argument that gave fans a window into the specific ugliness of what had been happening behind the scenes during the band's most commercially productive period. Among the 20 worst divorces in heavy metal history, their split sits as the most sustained and most bitterly maintained, a professional disagreement that became a personal wound that neither side allowed to close across years of separate careers that kept producing occasions for the argument to be reopened. Before moving ahead, take a quick second to subscribe to the channel and stay tuned for the next story. 14. Coal Chamber. Coal Chamber were one of the more visually arresting and musically distinctive acts that the nu metal scene produced, and their specific combination of gothic visual aesthetics and heavy riff-driven aggression gave them an identity that separated them from most of their contemporaries operating in the same commercial space during the late 1990s. The band built a real following through touring and a succession of albums that demonstrated both commercial instincts and genuine creative personality. The internal situation the music obscured was considerably less coherent than the product being delivered to audiences. The tension between vocalist Des Fafara and guitarist Meigs Raskin reached its most public and most damaging expression during a live performance in Texas in 2002 when the two men physically fought each other on stage in front of the audience. The moment confirmed what insiders had understood for some time: that the relationship between the band's two most prominent creative figures had broken down to a point where the pretense of professional function could no longer be maintained even during a performance. The show ended and the band was effectively finished. They reunited in 2011 and released Rivals in 2015, an album that demonstrated enough creative continuity to generate genuine attention from the fan base that had followed them since the 90s. Then, Fafara declared in 2016 that the band was permanently finished, a statement delivered with the finality of someone who had tried to rebuild something and discovered that the damage from the original collapse was more complete than the reunion had been willing to acknowledge. Among the 20 worst divorces in heavy metal history, their story is the most physically dramatic, the only one that produced an actual fistfight in front of a paying audience. 13. Skeletonwitch. Skeletonwitch had built a reputation as one of the more exciting and musically genuine bands in the modern black and thrash scene, and vocalist Chance Garnett was the voice that most fans associated with everything that made the band distinctive. His presence had been central to the recordings and the live experience across the years the band had spent developing their audience, and the specific energy he brought to the material was the kind that gets described as irreplaceable by the people who encounter it consistently. In 2014, that energy became irreplaceable in a different and considerably more serious sense. Garnett was arrested on charges of domestic assault, and the band responded with a speed and a decisiveness that left almost no room for ambiguity about where they stood. They cut ties almost immediately and did not make extensive public statements explaining the decision in detail. The directness of the separation reflected a judgment that the situation required action rather than discussion, and the band moved into the difficult and uncertain period of operating without the vocalist who had defined their sound for anyone who had found them through the recordings. They eventually brought in Adam Clemens as a replacement vocalist in 2018, and the band that emerged from that transition sounded different enough from what had preceded it that the question of continuity was genuinely complicated. Some of the original fan base came back. Others had already moved on. Among the 20 worst divorces in heavy metal history, their story reflects the specific version of the phenomenon where the split was driven not by internal creative conflict, but by external conduct that made continuing the existing arrangement simply untenable regardless of anyone's musical preferences. 12. Life of Agony. Life of Agony built a sound that connected with listeners in a way that went past conventional metal appreciation into something that felt more like identification. And the specific emotional authenticity of vocalist Mina Caputo's delivery on recordings like River Runs Red was the quality that made the connection feel personal and permanent to the fans who had found the band during their most celebrated period. What those fans were hearing was real. The pain in the voice was real. The identity struggle that made the pain real was something the world would not fully understand until years after the band had already collapsed under its weight. Caputo left in the late 90s amid personal struggles that she would eventually disclose publicly as connected to her gender identity and the impossibility of sustaining a performing life while those questions remained unresolved internally. The band attempted to continue with a replacement vocalist, and the attempt was honest but unsuccessful in the way that replacements for genuinely irreplaceable voices tend to be unsuccessful. By 1999, the band had shut down entirely, acknowledging what the failed continuation had demonstrated, that the specific voice and the specific person behind it were the same thing. Caputo's eventual public discussion of her transition gave the metal community a more complete understanding of what had been happening behind the scenes during the years the band had been performing, and then during the years it had fallen apart. Among the 20 worst divorces in heavy metal history, Life of Agony's dissolution stands as the most personal, a breakup whose real cause had nothing to do with the genre's conventional sources of band conflict and everything to do with a human being finding it impossible to continue until the world understood who she actually was. 11. Pentagram. Pentagram carved out a position in the doom metal world across decades of recordings that demonstrated a genuine and uncompromising commitment to the darkest end of what heavy music could express. Bobby Liebling had been the face and voice of the band since its earliest incarnation, and his presence was so completely identified with what Pentagram was that the question of the band without him was effectively the question of whether the band could exist at all. Fans who followed the band closely had watched Liebling battle his personal demons across multiple decades and understood that the music and the man were inseparable in ways that made his continued involvement both essential and precarious. In 2017, the precariousness produced its worst outcome. Liebling was arrested for assault and abuse, convicted and sentenced to 18 months in prison. Guitarist Victor Griffin stepped into the vocal role, and the band continued performing shows during the incarceration period, a decision that reflected both commitment to the music and the absence of any clean alternative that would have felt less compromised. The performances that resulted demonstrated that Griffin could hold the stage but could not replicate what Liebling's presence meant to the band's identity. Among the 20 worst divorces in heavy metal history, Pentagram's situation is the one where the split was produced by the criminal conduct of the vocalist rather than by internal band conflict, creating a circumstance in which the band was simultaneously the victim of their most important member's behavior and the entity tasked with somehow carrying the music forward in his absence. Every interview asked about it. Every show carried the weight of it. There was no version of their situation that did not involve significant loss. 10. Korn. Korn established nu metal as a genre, and the commercial momentum behind them during their most commercially dominant period was large enough to sustain even the significant disruption that arrived when founding guitarist Brian Head Welch made the decision that changed everything in 2005. The band was still selling records, still filling arenas, still generating the kind of commercial returns that most acts in heavy music never approach at any point in their careers. Welch walked away from all of it because he had concluded that staying was incompatible with the person he had decided he needed to become. His methamphetamine addiction had reached a severity that made functioning within the demands of the band's commercial schedule genuinely impossible, and his conversion to Christianity gave him both the framework and the motivation to make a departure that the music world received as one of the more dramatic and unexpected exits the genre had produced. He wrote about the experience publicly, the addiction and the faith, and the specific decision to leave in ways that gave the split a transparency that most band breakups never achieve, regardless of how much is eventually said about them. The 8-year gap between his departure and his return in 2013 was long enough to allow the band to demonstrate that they could continue without him, while simultaneously demonstrating that the specific quality his presence had contributed was not fully replicable by the musicians who played the parts he had vacated. Among the 20 worst divorces in heavy metal history, their split is the most spiritually motivated on the list. A guitarist who chose faith over a career that was still succeeding and who eventually returned to discover that the door he had walked through 8 years earlier was still open. 9. Rage Against the Machine. Rage Against the Machine arrived at the end of the 1990s as one of the most politically coherent and sonically powerful acts the heavy music world had produced, and the combination of Tom Morello's guitar innovation and Zach De La Rocha's vocal delivery gave the band an identity that felt genuinely irreplaceable in the way that only a combination of truly specific individual talents can. They broke up in 2000 and stated creative differences as the reason, which was true in the general sense that people who have fundamentally different visions for what they are building tend eventually to stop being able to build it together. The reunion in 2007 generated significant excitement and commercial momentum, but the fire that had made the original recordings feel genuinely urgent was harder to locate in the context of a reunion tour than it had been in the context of the band's initial creative explosion. They stopped again in 2011 without explanation sufficient to satisfy the fan base that had been waiting for new music and a sustained recommitment to what the band had originally represented. The 2020 return announced a full tour that the pandemic canceled, and a leg injury sustained by De La Rocha extended the delay further. In 2024, the band broke up for what De La Rocha's public statement suggested was a permanent and final time. Among the 20 worst divorces in heavy metal history, their story reflects the specific problem of a reunion that cannot adequately recreate the conditions that made the original significant. A band that built its identity on genuine political urgency, discovering that the passage of time and the commercial context of a comeback are poor substitutes for the moment in which the music was actually necessary. 8. Queensrÿche. Queensrÿche built a reputation as one of the most musically ambitious and intellectually serious bands in the history of progressive metal, and the catalog they assembled across their most celebrated period placed them among the genre's most respected acts by any honest measurement of what respect means in a creative context. Jeff Tate's voice was the instrument most directly associated with what made those recordings significant. A fact that made the internal deterioration of the band's creative and personal relationships more consequential than a similar deterioration might have been inside a band whose identity was less completely identified with a single member's contribution. The other members voted to remove Tate in 2012 after years of accumulated conflict over creative decisions, financial arrangements, and the basic question of how a band makes collective decisions when one member believes the others exist primarily to support his vision. Tate refused to accept the outcome and launched his own touring operation under a variation of the Queensrÿche name, producing the genuinely strange situation of two groups of people claiming to represent the same band playing concerts simultaneously for a confused fan base trying to determine which version deserved their loyalty and their ticket money. The legal resolution in 2014 awarded the name to the majority of the original lineup and gave Tate specific rights over the Queensrÿche catalog he had made famous. Among the 20 worst divorces in heavy metal history, their battle stands as the most legally complex and the most publicly embarrassing. A dispute that took one of progressive metal's most respected institutions and turned it into a courtroom argument visible to everyone who had ever cared about the band's music. 7. Sepultura. Sepultura were Brazil's most significant and commercially successful heavy metal export, and Max Cavalera was not just the band's founder and frontman, but the creative and spiritual center of everything that made the band's most celebrated albums connect with audiences across multiple continents. His departure in 1996 was driven by a combination of factors that were simultaneously professional and deeply personal in a way that made clean resolution essentially impossible from the moment the crisis began. The death of his stepson Dana Wells in a car accident created a grief that the band's continuing schedule did not adequately accommodate. The specific trigger for Max's departure was the band's decision to part ways with his wife Gloria as their manager, a decision he experienced as a betrayal that went beyond the professional into the personal in ways that the other members of the band either did not fully appreciate or did not prioritize over the business considerations that had driven the management change. He left and formed Soulfly. The band retained the Sepultura name with a new vocalist, and the fan base divided in the way that fan bases divide when the person most identified with a band's identity goes one direction and the name goes another. The brothers, Max and drummer Igor Cavalera, eventually estranged as well, with Igor departing from Sepultura in 2006, removing the last direct familial connection to the band's founding lineup. Among the 20 worst divorces in heavy metal history, Sepultura's disintegration is the most family-specific. A split that moved through professional disagreement into personal betrayal into the gradual erosion of a brotherhood that the music had always presented as the band's foundational identity. 6. Lamb of God. Lamb of God built their reputation as one of the most powerful and genuinely aggressive acts in modern American metal, and the music they produced during their most celebrated period reflected a creative intensity that the genre's most devoted listeners recognized as the real thing rather than a commercial approximation of it. The internal reality behind the music across the period of the band's greatest commercial momentum was something considerably more fragile. Randy Blythe was struggling with depression and alcohol in ways that the relentless touring schedule made progressively more difficult to manage. And the other members of the band were watching someone they cared about become increasingly difficult to reach while the career that surrounded him kept demanding more. The arrest in 2012 at Prague Airport generated the kind of immediate and dramatic crisis that the band had no preparation for and no adequate framework to manage. Blythe was held for 37 days in Pantera prison while Czech authorities built a manslaughter case connected to a 2010 incident in which a fan had been pushed from the stage during their set and subsequently died. The uncertainty about the outcome, which carried the possibility of a sentence measured in years, sat over everyone connected to the band while the case moved forward. His acquittal in 2013 brought relief but did not erase the weight of what the preceding period had demanded from everyone involved. Among the 20 worst divorces in heavy metal history, their entry is the only one where the external legal system rather than internal band dynamics produced the central crisis, making it the most genuinely frightening chapter in the genre's history of near collapses, a band that came within a Czech court verdict of a very different and much darker version of its story. 5. Guns N' Roses. Guns N' Roses assembled one of the most talented and most volatile lineups in rock history and burned through the commercial potential of that talent with a speed that even the genre's most chaotic precedents did not fully anticipate. The combination of Axl Rose's voice and vision, Slash's guitar playing, and the specific chemistry of the lineup that recorded Appetite for Destruction represented something genuinely rare. A group of people whose individual capabilities combined to produce something larger and more significant than any of them could have produced separately. The interpersonal dynamics that made the chemistry possible were also the dynamics that made the chemistry unsustainable. Steven Adler's addiction reached a severity that compromised his ability to function within the band's requirements, and he was replaced before the Use Your Illusion albums were recorded, removing the first significant element of the original lineup from the equation. Axl's habit of starting concerts hours late, the onstage confrontations, the St. Louis riot that resulted from his decision to jump into the crowd to confront a fan, and the general unpredictability that made every Guns N' Roses event an exercise in genuine uncertainty, all contributed to an environment in which Slash eventually concluded that the professional relationship was no longer viable. His departure removed the creative counterweight that had always existed between his musical instincts and Axl's, and the band that continued under the Guns N' Roses name without him was a different entity regardless of what the merchandise said. Among the 20 worst divorces in heavy metal history, their disintegration is the most commercially consequential. The waste of a talent combination that the genre has never reassembled in a form capable of producing anything remotely comparable to the original. 4. Led Zeppelin. Led Zeppelin chose not to end their band. They were forced to. The distinction matters because almost every other entry on this list involves choices made by musicians who could theoretically have made different choices and produced a different outcome. What happened at Jimmy Page's home in Windsor on September 24, 1980 was not a choice. John Bonham drank the equivalent of approximately 40 shots of vodka across the course of a single day, was put to bed, and did not wake up. He was 32 years old, and he was the reason Led Zeppelin sounded the way Led Zeppelin sounded. The band did not audition replacements. They did not tour with a stand-in or release a statement about taking time to grieve before reconsidering their options. They announced that Led Zeppelin would cease to exist because Led Zeppelin without John Bonham was not Led Zeppelin in any sense that the remaining members were willing to put their names to. The speed and the finality of that decision was striking in a genre where bands routinely continue through lineup changes that compromise their essential character far more than the replacement of a single member would have compromised Zeppelin's. The specific loyalty embedded in that decision produced one of the more remarkable legacies in the genre's history. A band that the world has spent 45 years wishing would reunite, and that has consistently declined to do so on the grounds that the person without whom the reunion would be dishonest is permanently unavailable. Among the 20 worst divorces in heavy metal history, Led Zeppelin stands apart because the split was not the result of anything the band did to itself. The music ended because one of its essential elements was taken rather than lost, which is a different kind of ending from everything else on this list. 3. Pantera. The collapse of Pantera was not a single event. It was a long and slow unraveling that produced an ending too painful and too permanent for any of the people involved to fully process while it was happening. Phil Anselmo's back injury during the peak touring years of the mid-90s opened a door to heroin that changed him in ways his bandmates watched from a distance that kept widening. The recording of the 1996 album Far Beyond Driven saw the band working in separate studios, the singer physically and emotionally removed from the musicians he was making the record with. The silence between them was its own kind of statement. The formal dissolution in 2003 arrived after years of creative and personal estrangement that had made the band's continuation a pretense rather than a genuine creative partnership. The ending was painful, but it was at least an ending, a point at which the accumulated damage could, in theory, begin to find some resolution among the people who had built something significant together and then watched it come apart. That resolution never came. 1 year after the breakup, Dimebag Darrell was shot and killed on stage in Columbus, Ohio on December 8, 2004. The 3 surviving members never had a final conversation that addressed what had happened between them during the years the band was falling apart. Vinnie Paul never forgave Anselmo for what he believed the singer's behavior had cost the band and took that unforgiveness with him when his own heart failed in 2018. Among the 20 worst divorces in heavy metal history, Pantera sits at position 3 because the pain of the split was made permanent in the most final possible way, leaving wounds that death ensured would never receive the healing that a genuine reconciliation might eventually have provided. 2. Metallica and Dave Mustaine. The specific transaction that occurred in the back of a van on a New Jersey highway in April of 1983 when Metallica handed Dave Mustaine a bus ticket back to Los Angeles produced consequences that the genre is still living with more than 40 years later. Mustaine had been a founding member, a guitarist of extraordinary ability, and a creative presence whose contributions to the early Metallica sound were real and significant and later partially acknowledged by the band in ways that satisfied neither side of the argument about how much credit he deserved. He was fired for behavior driven by alcohol and drug use that his bandmates had decided they could no longer manage or accommodate. The band went on to become the biggest heavy metal act in history. Mustaine went on to build Megadeth into one of the most important and critically respected thrash metal bands the genre produced. By any objective measurement, both outcomes represent significant achievement. By the subjective measurement that Mustaine applied to the situation across 40 years of interviews, the firing remained the defining wound of his professional life, the event that everything he subsequently built was a response to. The grievance that no amount of Megadeth's success fully addressed because success was never quite the same as being told you were wrong to have been fired. Among the 20 worst divorces in heavy metal history, the Metallica and Mustaine split sits at position 2 because its consequences were so disproportionately enormous relative to its cause. A personnel decision made by a band that was not yet famous produced 2 of the most significant acts in the history of thrash metal, each defined in different ways by the same moment of separation. The genre would not be what it is without both of them. Neither of them would be what they are without each other. That specific interdependence makes their breakup the most consequential on this list, even if it falls short of being the most painful. 1. Black Sabbath and Ozzy Osbourne. The firing of Ozzy Osbourne from Black Sabbath in 1979 was the single most consequential personnel decision in the history of heavy metal, producing a wound that became a defining feature of the genre's landscape for the following 4.5 decades and generating a rivalry whose impact on the music, the business, and the cultural identity of everything that came after it is almost impossible to overstate. The band that fired him went on to significant, continued success with Ronnie James Dio and other vocalists across subsequent decades. The man they fired went on to build a solo career that competed with the Sabbath legacy note for note across 40 years of parallel activity that neither side ever fully stopped measuring against the other. Ozzy has maintained across every subsequent decade that the firing was a mistake that the band spent the rest of its existence trying to recover from. The other members have maintained with equal consistency that the behavior driving the decision made the outcome unavoidable regardless of what it cost everyone involved. The truth of who was right about the central question is less interesting than the fact that both versions of what followed were genuinely extraordinary, which makes the split itself the most creatively productive rupture the genre ever produced, even as it was simultaneously one of the most personally damaging. The reunion that brought the original lineup back together for the 2016 farewell tour and the final concert at Villa Park in Birmingham on the 5th of July 2025 delivered what Ozzy had always maintained the world wanted and what the other members had resisted, providing across years of reunion conversations. He died 17 days after that final show at the age of 76. Among the 20 worst divorces in heavy metal history, Black Sabbath and Ozzy Osbourne's split sits at number 1 because it was the most consequential, the most personal, the most musically productive, and the most completely resolved by the two parties in the only way that the passage of 50 years eventually made possible, a final stage together before one of them was gone for good. And there they are. 20 of the most painful, most destructive, and most consequential band breakups heavy metal has ever produced. Some ended in lawyers. Some ended in silence. A few ended in ways that death made permanent before the people involved had found their way back to each other. The genre has always celebrated brotherhood and loyalty as core values, and the worst divorces in heavy metal history are the most honest measure of how completely those values can fail when the people carrying them are under enough pressure for long enough without adequate support. Which split on this list shocked you the most, and which breakup do you think the genre never fully recovered from? Drop it in the comments below. If this video moved you, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what we uncover next.